All right, we're going to be picking up in Daniel chapter 4. And just so that we're all on the same page, because it's been a couple of weeks since I was together with you, but you remember that there's been another dream. And do you remember what was going on in the last dream that Nebuchadnezzar had? Do you remember there was... there was a tree, wasn't there? And what happened to the tree? Do you remember what happened in the dream? Yeah, the tree gets cut down, and there's a part of the tree that's left. What's left when you cut down a tree? Got a stump. What happens to the stump? Do the termites get it? No, in the dream, what happens? Do you remember? It gets banded, so effectively protected, and how long is it in that state? It's going to be for 7 years. Anyway, so Nebuchadnezzar has this dream, and once again, the wise men in Babylon could not interpret or give him the meaning of this, so thankfully he consults Daniel, and Daniel says, hey, my hope is that this is about your enemies and not about you, because what did the dream mean? Do you remember? Well, it meant that Nebuchadnezzar's reign was going to stop. In fact, as part of the dream as well, it says, let him be drenched with dew from the sky, let his mind be changed from a human and be given that of an animal. That's in verse 16 of chapter 4. And he says, what's going to happen is that you're going to lose your mind. You're going to go crazy. And you're going to be acting like an animal. And you're going to be not in the palace, you're going to be out in the wild, essentially. And you're going to be acting like a wild, crazy bird. And how long is that going to last? 7 years. And if you go back to verse 25 of chapter 4, he says, it's going to be for 7 periods of time, so that's years. He says, until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms, and he gives them to anyone he wants. So he's saying, you're going to be in this state until what happens? How would we paraphrase that? You're quiet today. You brain dead, so you've been turned to animals. No, you are going to be in this state until you finally come to admit and acknowledge and understand and accept, ultimately, you're not in charge, but the God of heaven is. You've gotten too big for your britches, your head won't fit in the crown, and until you come back to reality and understand how things actually operate, you're going to be operating like a crazy man. And so he encourages him in verse 27. He says, may my advice seem good to you, my king. Separate yourself from your sins by doing what is right, and from your injustices by showing mercy to the needy. Perhaps there will be an extension of your prosperity. And so, in part, this is a call to repentance, to say, hey, maybe, just maybe, you can straighten your act up so that this doesn't become reality. But it also can refer to the fact that maybe once you finally come to your senses, that you operate correctly and that you're able to have an extension to your reign. All right, so that leads us, that's where we left off last time. So we finished with verse 27, so let's look at 28. It says, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar at the end of 12 months, as he was walking on the roof of the royal palace in Babylon. The king exclaimed, is this not Babylon the Great that I have built to be a royal residence by my vast power and for my majestic glory? How's that for a statement? Did you do that this morning? Like, did you go out on your back porch and say, is this not my home the great that I have built as my royal residence, indicating my vast power as a testimony to my majestic power? That's a pretty grandiose statement, isn't it? And what would we say about somebody like that? Do what? Oh, absolutely full of themselves. And just absolutely an ego that could not be contained. Now, here's the thing, though. Nebuchadnezzar is king over what is the dominant world empire. And we talked about this before. There's an extent to which you could say, or that Nebuchadnezzar could say, hey, I'm king of the world. Because he kind of was. He's king over the dominant world empire. And when you're king over the dominant empire, what is a big empire able to do? They kind of able to do anything that they want. And they tend to live large, don't they? They tend to do big, expansive things because it says, not only to the king, but it says to the people, boy, we are something. We are great. We are wonderful. Look at all that we have done. I hate being read to, but I want to read to you for just a moment because I can't really summarize this, really. But this will give you a sense of what Nebuchadnezzar looked out and saw. This comes from the New American Commentary. In verse 30, Nebuchadnezzar referred to the city as the Great Babylon, and it was indeed great, one of the preeminent cities of history. And during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, undoubtedly was the most magnificent and probably the largest city on earth. Babylon was a rectangular-shaped city surrounded by a broad and deep water-filled moat, and then by an intricate system of double walls. The first wall system to encompass the main city, its inner wall was 21 feet thick and reinforced with dense towers at 60-foot intervals. So think about a 21-foot or thick wall with towers, guard towers, every 60 feet. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? While the outer wall, so that's the inner wall. There was an outer wall that was 11 feet in width and also had watchtowers. Pretty difficult place to get into, isn't it? And this is worse than Fort Knox. Nebuchadnezzar added another defensive double wall system, which was an outer wall 25 feet thick and an inner wall 23 feet thick. You've got 4 layers of walls that if you add all of them together, that's 25. So add 11 plus 21 plus 23 plus 25. Those are some thick walls, aren't they? And these, so the inner wall, let's see, east of the Euphrates ran the distance of 17 miles and was wide enough at the top for chariots to pass. It's a pretty wide wall, isn't it? So chariots can actually pass on the top of these walls. Pretty impressive. 8 gates provided access to the city, the most celebrated of which was the Ishtar Gate on the north side. It was a massive double tower rising to 40 feet in height and decorated with dragons of Marduk and bulls of Hadad. So these aren't just like barn doors. These are elaborate, profoundly, excessively, tackily decorated walls that are and gates that have idol structures made as a part of them. Inside the city, there was a 7-level ziggurat that was 288 feet tall. You know what a ziggurat is? A ziggurat is kind of like, does anybody know what it's kind of like? I'm sorry? No, that's an obelisk. That's an obelisk. So a ziggurat is, and you tend to, most like in this part of the world, we're more familiar with them in Spanish cultures, like Aztec, Incan, that type of thing. But in this 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You'd say that kind of looks like a what? It's like so a ziggurat is like a pyramid. What would you say is the big difference between that and a pyramid? Yeah, so a pyramid tends to look just more rectangular. It doesn't have these ledges. And so Aztec and Incan cultures, you can see these today in South America in particular. All right, so within the city of Babylon, there was one of these that was 288 feet tall. So if a story is 10 feet, this is 28 stories. Now think about historically when this is. I mean, we talked about a 90-foot statue, but this is 3 times the height of that. This would have been absolutely massive. And you think about it, though, too, to get a structure to be 288 feet tall, how wide does it have to be? I mean, so it's got an enormous footprint. And this was going to be in the city, including 53 temples are said to have been present in the city. So we're not talking about throughout the empire. We're just talking about even in the capital city. We got 53 temples. We have these massive gates that have images to these pagan deities. You've got this thing, which is a ziggurat, and typically, and certainly was the case in Babylon, this would have been not simply a structure, big structure, magnificent thing to look at. This would have been a pagan temple as well. All right, so Nebuchadnezzar had at least 3 palaces in Babylon. Just so in the city, he had 3 palaces. I don't know why I didn't want to go somewhere else, but so there's 3 of them. The principal residence, I don't know why they gave this in. Was 350 by 200. Let me get a black pen here. So those are yards. So if you want to make that feet, this is 1,050 feet by 600 feet. So if you want to find out what's the square footage of that place, what do you want to do? All right, so we're going to multiply this by that, and that's going to give you 630,000 square feet. Now, just to give you some perspective, 630,000 square feet was one of the palaces. 630,000 square feet. Super Walmarts, on average, what do you think their footprint is? 180,000. Super Walmarts are really, really big, right? Because every time you go, whatever you need happens to be at the opposite corner of the store, right? And then once you get over there, you remember that the other thing you need also happens to be at the opposite corner of the store. And so one of his homes was 3 times that size, more than 3 times that size. Babylon also boasted, what else is it? Something else you remember for? The Hanging Gardens. All right, so the ancient Greeks, so they came later, they viewed it to be one of the 7 wonders of the world. According to ancient historians, Nebuchadnezzar constructed these for his wife, who left her native mountain home for Babylon, which is not a mountainous city. And so he, in effect, built a mountain in the city to remind his wife of her former homeland. That's pretty impressive, isn't it? These were elevated gardens high enough to be seen beyond the city wall. How big were the city walls? We talked about those. Amazing what this thing was. And about all of this, what does Nebuchadnezzar say? Look at me, look at me, look at me, look at what I have done. So he has said, is this, in verse 30, is this not Babylon the Great that I have built? And he's talking not just about the city, but he's talking about the empire. And he says that I have built this. And he says to be a royal residence. So it's not just this 630,000 square foot house, but the whole empire. That this is my residence. This is my domain. This is where I hang out as a testimony to my vast power and as a reflection of my majestic glory. You'd have thought that he would have had a stroke. I mean, just from the pressure of his head swelling as he says this. Verse 31, while the words were still in the king's mouth, a voice came from heaven and said, King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is declared that the kingdom has departed from you. In terms of tense, what would we say that is? Past, present, future. If something has departed, is that past, present, future? It's past. So he's hearing this and he says, it's already gone. You will be driven away from people to live with wild animals. You will feed on grass like cattle for 7 periods of time until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms and he gives them to anyone he wants. At that moment, the message against Nebuchadnezzar was fulfilled. He was driven away from people. He ate grass like cattle, and his body was drenched with dew from the sky until his hair grew like eagle's feathers and his nails like bird's claws. Who do we say that sounds like? They're dead. Do you remember? Who would we say that sounds like? That until hair like eagle's feathers and nails like bird's claws? He flew. Howard Hughes. Doesn't it sound kind of like Howard Hughes? Because he became a crazy bird, didn't he? Big old nasty long fingernails. Also, some of the clerks that I've dealt with at Sam's. Like, I remember watching, I had to take something back to the customer service one day, and I watched her. I mean, so these enormously long fingernails, and she's like this on the cash register with her hands sideways, trying to. She might as well just put the button on her nose and just packed it. I mean, it was they were so long. All right. So you've got this guy who has built this. How do we say he has built it? I mean, the only thing that he did was what? In fact, he probably didn't even come up with the ideas. I mean, he is surrounded with sycophants and just people that are just essentially just suck-ups to him. That here's another idea. Why don't you build? How about a ziggurat? How about a ziggurat? Let's make it. How about 300 feet tall? Is it, I mean, just trying anything. Because that would have fed into this man's massive ego. And the more that they did that, the bigger that it got, so that he would say things like he has said here, looky at what I have done. I am amazing. I am wonderful. Look at all this that I have done. Even though in the end all he did was issue the orders for it to actually be done and constructed. But he is nevertheless king of this massive and profoundly wealthy empire. And it has gone to his head. This passage tells us, and I believe deals with two big subjects that I want to lead you to think about with me this morning. That's this. It tells us something about God's judgment, and it also tells us something about pride, about human pride and how God deals with it. So the first thing I want you to get is this. God's judgment is certain, but generally not swift. So if we say God's judgment is certain, what does that mean? It's going to happen. So it's not maybe. So we're saying about God's judgment, it does and it will come, but generally. Now, so generally is a qualifier, right? So what are we saying? So if I say that God's judgment is generally not swift, that means that sometimes it is. And are there instances where God judges swiftly? Can you think of one? Lot's wife. Well, actually, I would argue not quite. Ananias and Sapphira, I would say, that one's a pretty swift one. Oh, look at what we did, zap. All right, so they were goners immediately. But in Lot's wife's case, they didn't, on what basis would I say that didn't happen immediately? They were leaving, but why were they leaving the city? Because they had had warning. And so judgment came, but warning had already been issued. Generally, and while there are some exceptions, generally, while God's judgment is certain, it is generally not swift. On what basis would I say that based on what we have read here? Do you see anything? I would say that this didn't happen all of a sudden. Well, no, the judgment was going to last for 7 years. But notice the difference. But what's the difference between verses 27, 28, and then verse 29? You're given a little detail. He gives him a chance to right his wrong. How long is the chance? He gives him a whole year, doesn't he? So bear in mind, you've got this king who's had this dream that has been so unsettling. Daniel interprets it, and is there any doubt that being on the receiving end of this dream is not a good thing? You don't want this. You don't want this. The other thing is that God has repeatedly demonstrated his power, hasn't he? I mean, one of the most definitive examples was the whole fiery furnace thing. And you remember, we have had Nebuchadnezzar make repeatedly positive, faith-like statements about God, about how great God is, and about how great Daniel's God is, and all of this stuff. And so the single guy who is able to tell him what these dreams mean, in fact, sometimes even in the absence of hearing the content of the dream, he's still able to say, this is what the dream is, this is what it meant, and then it comes true. So he has told him, judgment is barreling towards you, and it's not going to be pleasant. It's going to last for at least 7 years, or 7 spans of time. And so my encouragement for you is to do what? Turn. And so as soon as he tells him this, as soon as the king hears this interpretation and hears this warning, did God judge him at supper time? Did he judge him the next Tuesday, the next month, the next quarter, the next season? No, it was a full 12 months before it happened. Now, I think this is important, but I think we have to think here with some balance. We have to remember that God is in control. He always has been. He always will be. He takes obedience seriously, and God is not indifferent to the disobedience of people, and judgment will come. Sometimes it can come swiftly. Like I said, Ananias and Sapphira, it came swiftly. But that is not generally how God works, because one of the regular hallmarks of God is that he is long-suffering towards us, isn't he? Can you think of some other examples where you'd say God was long-suffering? How would you say he was long-suffering towards them? Yeah, she said that they lived 900 years. I think Adam was like 932, because Methuselah was 969. I think Adam got 930. But there was a sense, and that one's a little more difficult, because there's a sense in which judgment came immediately, in the sense that all of a sudden mortality became a reality and the clock started ticking. But even then, he did still get the business end of 1,000 years before he actually died. What's another example of God's long-sufferingness? Like with Nineveh, I mean, so Jonah, reluctant is a strong word, I mean, is a weak word. Jonah finally goes to Nineveh, and when he preaches this message of judgment, he kind of preached it with a smile on his face, because he hated them, right? He's like, God's going to get you. You're goners. And God's issued that warning, and did judgment immediately come? It didn't come immediately. Instead, what happened? You remember that the people repented, even from the king all the way. Remember, even they had the animals decked out in sackcloth and ashes to demonstrate that, hey, God, we're serious about changing our ways. Somebody else says, what's another one? Yes, because the years that it took with the flood, and but even, I mean, if you look at the biggest bulk of the Old Testament is this series of warnings, isn't it? Where God sends a judge, he sends a prophet, he sends a message some way, somehow to Israel, right? And the message is consistently, I'm going to judge you. Bad stuff is heading towards you. I'm telling you, turn. And judgment would finally come, but oftentimes it was after lengthy, expansive periods of time, and sometimes prophet after prophet, or judge after judge, or messenger after messenger, before God would actively finally press the button to cause them to experience the judgment. So what I want you to realize is that generally how God works with judgment is that while it is certain and it will come, it's not that he's trying to muster his courage. It's not like he's trying to say, I don't know if I should do that. It's not indecision on God's part. Instead, what is it? It's His grace, because what does He really want? He wants people to turn to Him. And so there's no delight that is found in bringing these adverse consequences, but it will come. And so while judgment is certain, generally how it is that God operates is with patience, and sometimes lengthy amounts of patience. But what's the caveat that we got to keep in mind? It will always be there at the end, and there's no guarantees about how long it might be delayed. So, unfortunately, what we can do is to lull ourselves into thinking, well, I can do X, Y, and Z, and God's going to be okay with that. I've got time. I can get away with this. I'll straighten my act up later. Generally, God is providing some significant wiggle room, but don't bet on it, because you will do so at your own peril. Just ask, again, Ananias and Sapphira, right? All right, so God's judgment is certain, but generally not swift. And typically how He operates is that He operates with some measure of warning, and then there is some waiting period. It can be longer, it can be shorter. In this case, He gave Nebuchadnezzar 12 months. The second thing I'd want you to get with respect to God's judgment is this, that God's judgment has redemptive goals. God's judgment has redemptive goals. But by saying that God's judgment has redemptive goals, I'm saying that as opposed to something else. And instead of letting you sit there and guess what that would be, let me just go ahead and tell you. That God brings judgment with redemptive goals rather than punitive satisfaction. And what does that mean? Anybody want to take a stab at it? That God's judgment has redemptive goals rather than punitive satisfaction. Right? There's no delight in doing this. I don't know. Sometimes bringing some judgment to bear feels good, doesn't it? Those of you who are parents, sometimes all that nonsense about this hurts you worse than it does me, we just tell that to kids so that they... It's like Santa Claus. We put that out there. It sounded good on a T-shirt. But sometimes it feels good, doesn't it? You're like, they have been, it feels good to correct this, to deal with this. And again, I'm saying that with somewhat tongue-in-cheek. But if you've ever had individuals that you were in a supervisory capacity over, or maybe it is that you have witnessed it from just even in terms of the legal system. I mean, that somebody has done something terrible and they get the book thrown at them, you're like, yeah, that's good. Or if you were the judge that was able to do that, if you were on the jury that was able to do that, there are some times that it just feels really good to get back at them and to punish them and to just kind of smack them, right? That's finding satisfaction in being punitive, that I want to punish you, I want to get back at you, and I'm glad to kind of stick it to you. What I want you to understand is that God does not operate that way towards me, towards you, or towards anyone. There is zero delight, I think, in the heart of God when He brings judgment into and onto the lives of people. He is bringing punishment. He is bringing judgment. And it's not so that He can say, man, that felt good to just to get them. He is doing this why? Yeah, because he what He's looking for is redemption. What He's looking for is repentance. What He's looking for is for people to turn to Him. In fact, notice what you see at the end of verse 32. He says, this is going to happen. And so this is in keeping with the prophecy from the dream itself, but again, he's hearing this voice. And so it's the voice of God saying, the kingdom has already been taken from you. I've already got the keys to it. They're already gone. You're getting ready now to experience this stuff. And he said, this is going to happen until you do something, until you acknowledge that the Most High is ruler over human kingdoms and that he gives them to anyone who wants. Until you finally get it through your thick head that you are not ultimately in charge and that this is not your world and you are not king over it. And that at the end you are subservient, as everyone is, to the one who has made everything. And so I'm going to bring this judgment into your life, this corrective behavior, not because it puts a smile on my face, but because I've got a goal in mind, which tells us again that God's, with respect to judgment, with respect to discipline, that God's judgment has redemptive goals. Something would stop the judgment. Verse 32 tells us something would stop it when he finally understands he's not in control. And it was going to take something pretty big, wasn't it? Because his head is enormously large. All right, so I told you that this passage says something to us about judgment, says something to us about pride. And with respect to pride, I believe it communicates this, that God always responds to personal pride. God always responds to personal pride. And I think we need to think for a moment about the word pride, because we use this word in a variety of different ways, don't we? At least we use it with shades. And so is there any sense in which we use this word, or proud, that we would say it's okay, and that we would say, I think God is okay with that? Is there any way that we use that the word or this experience? I'm sorry? Yeah, and so sometimes, like, let's pick a hobby. What's going to be your hobby? What hobby you want to have? Ceramics. So let's say you want to do ceramics. And so what do we want to make? We'll make a pot. Well, actually, let's make a ceramic pumpkin because it's fall now, all right? So we've made a ceramic pumpkin, and it turns out, so you have fashioned it, you fired it, you painted it, it looks wonderful, and you show it to your friend, and you may say, "No, I made this pumpkin. I'm pretty proud of it." Now, if somebody said that, would you think? Because in that sense, what would you say they are suggesting? Yeah, that they're satisfied that they did it how they wanted to. Do you think that God is okay with that experience? Because I think when we that, and bear in mind that work existed before sin came into the world, and God wants us to work, and He wants us to do our best. And as we work and as we do things, as we perform tasks, we ought to be shooting for excellence, and we ought to feel some measure of satisfaction when we've actually performed and operated with some excellence, right? So I think God is okay with that. What's another way that we might use this word? Yeah, with your children. And I don't know, it could be something significant they did. It could be something insignificant that they did. Maybe it was that, I don't know, there have been some instances where we have been out in public, or we've been in a restaurant, and somebody has come up to us and said, I just want to say, it looks like you're doing a really good job with your kids. They're all so well behaved. And that feels really good, and it makes you feel proud as parents of your kids. And I think I would say that in a positive sense, right? But again, it's the same type of thought, that there is this satisfaction in doing something with some measure of competence, or with that you're doing it, satisfaction about doing something right. Okay? So there's that. But then there's other ways that we use the word proud or pride, where it says what? Well, the pride goes before the fall, but what are other ways? Like, is God okay with this? What way is it that he's not okay with it? What does it look like? Certainly with a statement like you see with Nebuchadnezzar. And oftentimes we see that, and unfortunately we can look back in hindsight and probably see instances in our own lives where we have had the out of bounds form of this, the kind that God is not okay with. And typically it doesn't have to do with satisfaction, but it is it's an expression of comparison.
It often is bad when we're trying to, in relationships, you're too proud to say you're sorry for something, that kind of thing.
And I would argue even then that is the type of pride that I believe that really angers God, that he is always going to respond to, is the type of pride that is rooted in comparison. By that, what do you think I mean? Yeah, that you look at yourself in relation to others or other things, and you think what? Yeah, look at me. Look at me. All right, so God is not interested in inflating your ego or boosting your pride. God is interested in demonstrating what? This is a concept we've talked about repeatedly. God is interested in demonstrating His glory. Correct. What I want you to understand is that this is a concept that is rooted in comparison. What I want you to understand also is that this term is rooted in comparison. All right, here's how I mean that. I have given you, over the years, repeatedly, Michael's definition for God's glory. Do you remember what it is? It's clearly made an impact on you. I can't tell you how much this has helped me when I look at passages that talks about that God revealing His glory. Every time I do that, I insert this particular phrase, and it causes that passage for me to make sense. So when we're talking about God's glory, we're talking about this fact that God is greater than anyone and anything. Doesn't that make sense? So, for example, when in the prologue of John's Gospel, when he says of Jesus that we beheld His glory, the glories that only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. When we beheld His glory, what was he saying of Jesus? We saw what? He's greater than anyone and anything. Because otherwise, if you don't think about what this word actually means, you're kind of left like, I don't know how to describe that. It's almost like he glowed. I mean, he was just kind of bright. But I really believe sincerely that this will help you unlock a whole stack of passages and cause them to make sense. But do you understand why I say that this is a statement that is rooted in comparison? Right? Because the glory, what God is interested in demonstrating is, and manifesting is, and for people to recognize is His glory. He wants people to recognize that He is not, God is not interested in people understanding that He is great. He's interested in people understanding that He is greater. That's a comparison statement. That He is greater than what? Anyone and anything. Than a mountain? Yes. Than a goat? Yes. Than a king? Yes. Than a president? Yes. Than a country? Yes. Than anything. You pick it. Whatever it is, He is greater than that. This is a comparison statement. Pride is also a comparison statement, because pride says, what? I am better. Pride doesn't just say I'm good or I am satisfied, I'm okay with. Pride, the type that the Bible is talking about, is a comparison statement that I am as compared to others, as compared to other powers, in comparison to anything. Somehow I am better. Look at me. And so if God's primary aim to demonstrate to us is His glory, this is an absolute affront to Him, isn't it? Because it is trying to create the absolute opposite. I mean, at the end, if you want to define pride, pride is rooted in this thought, that I am greater than anyone and anything. And in truth, listen to that statement. Is this not Babylon the Great that I have built to be a royal residence by my vast power and for my majestic, notice the word that he uses, for my majestic glory. Remember the Three Stooges? This is doing that to God. And when you try to do this to God, do you know what He does every time? It's not going to work. It's absolutely not going to work. And so, why He brings judgment into Nebuchadnezzar's life is because he always responds to pride. Now, sometimes God actively responds to pride, and here you see an active case of it. He causes Nebuchadnezzar to have the pause button pressed on his reign and to act like a crazy bird, and to get to a point where he's out there eating with animals. And it seems that there would have been some moments of lucidity, but it's like he was operating out of the bounds of his ability to control. His hair, it whitens, it becomes long and gangly. I mean, some of you know what it was like to go for a few months without a haircut during the COVID thing. He's gone probably 7 years. He's not cutting his fingernails. He looks, it'd be nasty. I mean, this joker would have been a sight. That happened because God was actively working against him. But sometimes God can work against pride passively and just allowing things to happen. Now, Gene quoted Solomon from Proverbs. You're probably familiar with it. Pride does what? It goeth before destruction or comes before the fall. In the end, anyone who is demonstrating pride, eventually some cracks begin to form, don't they? Because pride says, I am better. In fact, left unchecked, it becomes almost this unqualified sense that I'm essentially perfect. Everybody else is a bunch of screw-ups, but look at me. Sometimes God actively works and brings judgment. Sometimes God brings judgment by simply letting that train stay on track. Because when you have somebody that is operating like, look at me, I am so wonderful, I'm blah 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 blah, I'm so great, what tends to happen? They tend to screw up, don't they? And let you think with me about this. Over the years with the kids, I have spent a lot of time at playgrounds, and one of the things that, in fact, there's one over here in Adams Farm, over at that playground. There's a balance beam over there, and that particular one, and there's mulch all over the playground area, but that balance beam is it's less than knee high off the ground, and it's, I don't know, 4 inches wide. And I will walk across that. Ooh, look at me. I can pass a DUI check. And I will do that and not think twice about it. It's no big deal, right? But do you remember seeing at some point some of the pictures from when the Empire State Building was constructed? And, it's got this massive steel skeleton, and not just with the Empire State Building, but a lot of these iron workers. And so you've got this iron steel skeleton, and they're walking around on these beams like 1,000 feet in the air. And I talked to you just the other week about getting up on our one-story roof and just being petrified, thinking the fire department was going to have to get me off. I could not imagine that. But I'm telling you, every time I walk across that balance beam, I think, in the end, I'm doing the same thing that they were doing, except what? Theirs is a lot higher, and the consequences when you're a lot higher become a lot greater, don't they? The fall becomes greater. The consequences of the falls are greater the higher you are. Sometimes God actively judges pride. But sometimes what God does is just allow it to just do what it's going to do. Because in the end, every one of us is a screw up. You know that. Every one of us, at some point, we're going to stumble and we're going to fall. But when you, by virtue of pride, get elevated and you get really high, that fall becomes far more notable and the consequences far greater. And so in that sense, I would argue that God is still bringing judgment, but just simply allowing this to do what by nature it is going to do. That's why Solomon in his vast God-given wisdom said that it comes before the fall. When? All the time. Always. I want to finish chapter 4 real quick. Verse 34 says, "At the end of those days, I, Nebuchadnezzar, looked up to heaven, and my sanity returned to me. I praised the Most High, honored and glorified Him who lives forever. He said, His dominion is an everlasting kingdom. His kingdom is from generation to generation. The inhabitants of the earth are counted as nothing. He does whatever He wants with the army of heaven, the inhabitants of the earth. There is no one who can block His hand or say, 'What have you done?' At that time," verse 36, "my sanity returned to me, my majesty and splendor returned to me for the glory of my kingdom. My advisors and nobles sought me out. I was reestablished as over my kingdom, and even more greatness came to me. And I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise, exalt, and glorify the King of heavens, because all His works are true, His ways are just. He is able to humble those who walk in pride." So, when I said earlier that God's judgment has redemptive goals, the redemptive goals of God's judgment have been realized. And at this point, Nebuchadnezzar finally realizes, hey, I am not... Sorry, I was pinching the mess out of my ear. I am not the greatest thing since sliced bread. I am not ultimately in charge. I'm still operating under His feet. Here's the question, and we can't answer this with any definitive conclusion. Would you say at that point that this was effectively a salvation level faith? Yeah, would you say that's a salvation level faith? Darnell says yes. Anybody say no? Or probably not? It's okay, you can say that, because you could be right. You could also be wrong. And people have lined up on both sides of the issue. So, like, for example, John Walvoord, I don't know if you're familiar with him, from Dallas Theological, he said he felt like this was effectively a faith-based salvation claim. Yeah, maybe. But to me, it sounds pretty similar, and that's why, like, for example, John Calvin says, no, I don't think, like, for Calvin, this was no different than some of the other faith-like positive God statements that he's made before. She said she felt like it was different than some of the other statements that he had made. And certainly maybe in terms of, I mean, he does say it's a more expansive statement, and he fleshes it out more, to be sure. What I want you to realize, though, is that you can still... I don't know. I don't know. He could be, he could not be. Because I do believe this is possible. That you, in fact, let me illustrate this way. I got to make a note so I say this tonight. All right, so it looks like, although abbreviated, college football is going to start. How many of you root for a team in college? All right, so there's a couple. Anybody that root? Do y'all root for anything else? NFL, baseball? Do what? All right, so you root for the Braves. Wayne, who college? Who you root for? Oh man, you talking about long suffering. Yeah, it's the motto that NC State is next season. Next season. 50 years ago when I did it a lot better. You may root and you may follow NC State. But if NC State plays the University of Alabama this week, what's going to happen? It's going to be a bloodbath. It would be an absolute bloodbath. Or if they were to play Clemson, what's going to happen? Almost certainly, it's going to be a bloodbath. Count your blessings. But in both cases, a State fan may grudgingly say Alabama is a better football team, wouldn't you? You would say Clemson is a better football team. But in the end, do you have an Alabama shirt? Do you have a Clemson shirt? What I believe is this, that someone, that's a need for a brake check. A brake check. Somebody, they finally stopped. I believe that, because thus far, I believe sincerely that Nebuchadnezzar has made some positive and true statements about God. Right? Oh, he's great. He's got knowledge, he has ability, significant ability. He's wonderful. He's all these things. I believe that somebody can believe those things and know those things to be true, but still decide, I'm not going to follow. Just like Wayne knows that NC State is not the best football team. There are other teams that are better, that would clobber his team, but that's not the one he's going to follow. All I'm saying is it's entirely possible that you have a guy here that understands God has shown him, listen, you're not in charge, I am. And he could say, you know what, I got you there, but still follow.
As the story goes on, what you're saying, I understand it, because his people coming after him that ruled Babel were not affected by what
Right.
happened to them. And if it was something that happened to him to really believe in God, then it should have trickled on down to his.
You would have thought. And so, if again, at the end of the day, we don't know. But if I'm a betting guy, I'd say probably not. Probably not. All right, so the takeaways, let me give them to you real quick again. God's judgment is certain, but generally not swift. But don't act cavalier and say, well, he's going to be, I'll have a stack of chances. You might not. God's judgment has redemptive goals always. It's not that he's trying to make you squirm and taking pleasure in it. It's because he's trying to get you from where you are, stuck in the weeds, to back following him. And then God always responds to personal pride. When you get to the point that you think is comparison to anyone or anything that you're better, that's an affront to God, because it's an assault against his glory, and he will not stand by idly with that. Any brilliant comments or additions? All right, so we want to stop now and pray for NC State so that let's pray. Lord, thank you for giving us a chance to walk through this passage today. And I think these truths that we've spent some time thinking about, I believe they're consistently borne out in the whole of Scripture. But I pray that these are also truths that are demonstrated in our lives, in our walk with you, where we need to turn ourselves down and turn you up. I pray that we will. If pride is becoming a stumbling block for us and putting us on the business end of your judgment. I pray that short of drastic consequences, that you're able to bring humility into our walks, because that's the type of person that you can use. That's the type of life that you can work through. So we ask your blessings on us as we go in Christ's name. Amen.